Utilities and Telecommunications Committee. Welcome committee members on this first day of February. Good news is we don't have to meet on Groundhog Day. So it won't feel like we're here over and over and over again. This morning, start with bill introductions. Are there any bill introductions from any member of the committee? Anybody got their hand up online? No? All right. Any bill introductions from the gallery? All right. Quiet group today. Would remind everybody that we're coming up again on the bill introduction deadline. So Thursday this week will be the last day for members to request a bill introduction, or gallery members to request a bill introduction in this committee, because the deadline is Monday. We won't meet again before the deadline. Remember that as a request for basically a committee bill to be introduced. If you're doing individual bills down at the clerk's desk on the floor, that's different. But want to make sure everybody knows so nobody later says, I had no idea. I have a great utilities idea. The world needs to hear it. So deadline will be Thursday. So with that, we'll move on to working our HCR 5023. Would ask everyone to open your folder. You should have a tab, a little green tab with HCR 5023. As we discussed at the beginning of the year, I tend to work these things in what's called Senate style. So we were now working the resolution. Does any member have any proposed amendment to the resolution? Looking left, looking right. No one online. Is there a motion concerning the fate of HCR 5023? Hands online.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Keither.
I so move that we pass House Concurrent Resolution number 5023.
We have a motion and a second from Representative Gartner. Is there discussion on the motion to pass this resolution out favorably? Seeing no discussion, we'll proceed to vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. We will recommend this favorably for passage. If anybody is chomping at the bit to carry the resolution on the floor, come see me. We'll talk about that. We'll get a carrier assigned, and we will put Representative Schreiber to work on a bill brief so we can get this teed up for the House floor. Thank you, committee, for your work on that. This morning, we have a briefing on nuclear energy, and we're going to hear from a couple of gentlemen, one who's actively in the nuclear business and one who will talk to us a little bit about small-scale nuclear in the future. If you're remembering the context of our conversations, coal and natural gas and nuclear are some of our dispatchable power sources, the ability for someone to call up and say, we need this many megawatts of power, and they can produce up to their capacity. So it is an area that we've not seen in Kansas anyway, a lot of new development since Wolf Creek, but it is one of the sources of dispatchable power, and so it merits further discussion in our conversations today. And with that, I think we'll open up our informational briefing. And by the way, I will have to leave you soon. Representative Schreiber will be here, so it's not because anyone said anything offensive or anything like that. I've been called into some other meetings this morning. So with that, we'll welcome Cleve Resner, Chief Nuclear Officer of the Wolf Creek Generating Station. Cleve, welcome to the committee. Glad to have you here today.
Thank you, Chairman Finch and committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. And typically I think when people hear the term nuclear and think about nuclear power, they first think about the technology, which certainly is special. But I can tell you it's really a people business because it's 24/7 and the high regulatory safety requirements around it. We have a large, highly skilled staff and very high performing, I'll say, and I'm proud and humbled to be representing them here today. As part of our information briefing, if we could go to the first slide. It's okay. I'll go forward if you're okay while you sort that out. Okay. Firstly, just at a glance, the plant is 1,200 megawatt, which is a relatively large. Standard nuclear plant is typically about 1,000 megawatts. So fairly large plant, which is an economy of scale benefit. Located about 60 miles south of here in Coffee County, Burlington, Kansas area. When operational, commercial power in 1985 with a 40-year license. We subsequently got that extended for another 20 years, so the plant now is licensed through 2045. As we approach that time frame, we would be making decisions about possible extension beyond then. And I can tell you, our plant is a four-loop Westinghouse, okay, so it's kind of like Ford, Chevy, Dodge kind of discussion. It's a Westinghouse machine, four-loop, meaning there are four pumps on the reactor. And it's a good plant, solid plant in terms of the design and the construction, and it's been maintained very well by our owners over the years. So the plant's in really good shape. As such, a testament to that, a few years ago in 2017, we set an all-time production record at our plant. So that again is a testament to our plant staff. You can see there the owner structure is 94% Evergy and 6% KEPCO. And because of that large area of Evergy and the associated co-ops with KEPCO, we touch a large percentage of the state, and proud to serve them. One of the special things about nuclear, if you think about it just for a second, is it's different. It has its unique elements. One is that we load the fuel in at one time with the notion that we're going to run for 500 days, 18 months, generally speaking. So if you think about the winter storm now about a year ago, we didn't have any fuel logistics challenges at our plant because all of our fuel is in the core and we focus on slowly metering it out as opposed to feeding fuel in and getting power out, if you will. So one of the unique facets and really goes towards diversity is critical in those kind of situations. That's one positive to our plan is that energy distribution in the core. So by the numbers, if you look, some factoids here, 18.5% of the power generated in the state, that's over a 3-year average, 18 through 20, 31% carbon-free generation. And carbon-free, of course, is a point of frequent discussion these days. Most people don't think about the fact that the nuclear industry has been producing carbon-free power now for many decades, okay? And as an industry, performance has continued to improve over that time, and it's a very collaborative industry. We share information. We have a higher calling around safety, so we share information, not like more normal competitive businesses. I know all my counterparts in the industry, and if I needed their help, I could call them and we would be sharing immediately. That happens on a daily basis. We're actually required to share information, really, to share operating experience. So if we learn something, we're required to share that. Others are required to use that information. So it's a very unique community, very close-knit, if you will. As I mentioned earlier, we touch a broad swath of the state, so 89 Kansas counties are connected to our power source. 800 full-time employees. I can tell you those are highly skilled jobs. We're a 24/7 business. We have many engineers, skilled craft operators, nuclear security, all these specialized jobs are really good jobs, and we have really good folks that work at our plant site. You can see some of the economics there, $46 million in property taxes, and it's about a 5-year-old study, about $165 million of economic benefit attributed there. I'll ask you to put your engineering hats on for just a second. This won't hurt too much, but we'll talk a little bit about how the plant operates. If you can see the picture provided there on the left, the yellow and orange it represents the water that circles through the reactor. So think of it pumping in a clockwise fashion. So it goes through the reactor, picks up heat, and then goes into the steam generator, which is just to the right, and uses that heat to boil water. Fundamentally, we boil water to make steam to make power, okay? So the only difference ours is the heat comes from a nuclear reaction, okay? So as you can see, the steam then goes out, spins the turbine, spins the generator. So fundamentally, we pump water in a circle is more of what we do on a daily basis. If you look at the next picture, it's just a glimpse into the plant. What's shown there is a picture inside the reactor building. If you'll notice down in the bottom center, that's a person in white. You can just see their upper part of their torso. Just behind them is a darkened circle. That's actually the reactor with the top works off. So the fuel is maintained underwater. So we flood up above the reactor, but that water is not normally in there. And then we can move fuel in and out of the reactor during a refueling outage. If you'll notice the yellow structure kind of in the center back there, that's actually the machine that moves the fuel back and forth. And just to the left of that, you can see yellow and magenta color. That's actually the reactor head, that kind of tall structure. And after we put the fuel in, bring that over and bolt that down and and put all the safety system connections in place. And look at the regulations and plant sites across the country. We are heavily regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We work with them on a daily basis. They have 2 resident inspectors that are on site all the time, or their resident work location is on site. They can pretty much see anything they want to see anytime they want to see it. Very purposefully have them engaged in our business so they can properly monitor our performance, and we certainly welcome that. You can see the distribution on the map here is the location of the plants across the country, the majority of which are located in population centers on the eastern part of the United States. In the last 5 or so years, about 10% of the plants, commercial nuclear power plants, have closed in the United States. Many of those are both older plants that aren't as economically viable, but also in some challenging economic situations. I would say that we are very smartly aware of that and work as an industry to ensure that we are a smart option in terms of economics and, of course, safety and other things are permissive to that. But our plant runs well, and we are in a good position. What was not shown on the map of the plan is all the other systems. We have a myriad of safety systems whose sole function is to sit and monitor performance of the plant. And if there's any sensed problem, those safety systems automatically actuate. So it's generation of generators making power, pumps moving water, and so forth. Those are redundant, so if you need one to perform a function, you'll have at least 2. You might have 3, and they will be in diverse parts of the plant, so one problem can't cascade into affecting both systems. Many of those systems don't operate on a normal basis, but we periodically test them, make sure that they perform just so, and on a daily basis, we're out running systems and validating performance. In the last decade, in response to, you might recall, the large tsunami that hit Japan and affected a plant over there, we have responded to that issue. I've personally been to that plant and been in that control room to make sure I absolutely understand the safety aspects of those kind of challenges. Partly in response to that, what we've done is we have staged separate equipment. And so it's non-scenario based. We normally think of, there's a tornado, it's this big, we can survive it by doing X. This scenario is you don't know why, but you've lost power. Okay, now what do you do? So we have backup systems that we put remote from the plant, and we put like RV hookups in the side of the plant so we can come in and plug in water, electricity, or whatever. So if an event occurred, we could move the debris out of the way, get our staged equipment, bring it into the plant, and we'd have yet another layer of redundancy. Then beyond that, we have centers in Phoenix and Memphis that the industry supports that has backup equipment also that could be brought to the station as needed. So very in-depth. What I'm trying to communicate to you is very thoughtful, layered notions about what's possible and sometimes even beyond what's possible to ensure that we absolutely can deal with any situation. Along those lines, emergency preparedness, we are required by the NRC and FEMA to have emergency response plans and organizations. We exercise those frequently. We're involved in a lot of agencies in doing that. Of course, that's all about protecting the public in the event that there was an issue. We have drills that are conducted in-house frequently, but required drills that are observed and evaluated every 2 years, and work closely with the state on those drills and ongoing planning. If you look at the next page, you'll see some of the other data points there. In-house, we will drill at least 4 to 8 times a year. Those are very extensive drills with unique circumstances, so our staff is really going to be challenged in those drills. We're going to make them, in a sense, fail and go to the backup layer. What I'm trying to communicate is that the staff takes those very seriously. So they know in the unlikely event we're ever there, they have the proficiency to execute properly, and they will go down the list and follow their procedures. We have had a new significant project that we've implemented just in the last 2 weeks. For the first time, we're actually moving fuel out into a dry storage, it's called. The original plans for the plant was that the Department of Energy would take the used fuel. That has not materialized, and you're probably familiar with all those facets of a federal repository not being commissioned. But we've now reached the limits of or approaching the limits of our storage on site, in our normal location. So we've built additional storage that is reimbursed by the Department of Energy. And we've actually just in the last 2 weeks first moved fuel into that area. So some of the pictures associated with that, you can see in the bottom left hand is the cask that the fuel will be stored in. If you can notice kind of the crosshatch pattern in the center there, that's where the fuel is going to be installed. In the right, it's a little bit hard to follow, but that person's hand is touching a long rod that is guiding a fuel assembly that's located on the bottom of that rod into that canister. Subsequently, on the next page, you'll see on the left, the canister is being carted out to its location, and then the concrete bunker on the right is where the fuel canisters will be inserted and they will be stored. And at that point, they're in a dry state, and they do generate a little bit of heat, but it's just natural conduction from the air flowing over those cylinders to keep them cool. Lastly, cybersecurity. You might be aware that we had an intrusion on the business network that made the news some 3 or 4 years ago. Now, the business network and the network associated with the plant are separate by design. There are regulations requiring the nature of how those systems are separated. And there are specific rules about safety functions, reactor control, security, and emergency preparedness that have to have those rules applied to them. We've installed all that equipment and functions well, but I'll say it's an ongoing thing to deal with cybersecurity. But we have met all the regulations and have been inspected on our cyber installations. With that, I'll stand for questions or take them at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Cleve. Are there questions from the committee? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You probably said this, but I missed it, and if so, I apologize. On slide 6, can you explain the color coding again?
So on slide 6, I'm sorry, I did not explain that. Those colors that are indicated there are only the regions of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Happens to be that they have 4 offices across the country.
So that's just region.
Yeah, we're Region 4 in Arlington, Texas, so that's the blue plants.
Thank you much.
Representative Berquist?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You mentioned that you showed that there was approximately 800 employees full-time. How many is there on the crew for the refueling process? There's a contract, is that right?
Yeah, if we're moving the dry fuels out that we showed in this,
Right.
for example, there's probably 100, 120, something like that.
And the system is totally shut down during that whole process?
During that, so let me make sure, separate these things out. In our normal refueling outage, when we add new fuel, take the old fuel out, that's a separate process, and again, probably around 100-ish kind of people involved directly with that activity. During this dry fuel, it's a separate activity that can go on while the plant is actually producing power.
Just one more question, if I could.
Yes.
And you said that, was it 2017 when you had an all-time record production?
That's correct.
Were you what you consider near capacity, or was there more capacity to be had?
Yeah, I'll answer that like this. And I told our station, it's the right way to set the record. I didn't know we set that record until January of the year after, because we don't put production over safety, okay? We were safe during that period of time and our reliability of all our equipment was very good. So yes, we were running at capacity, you would say.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Representative Keith, you're online.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Nice to see you. Thank you for your presentation. I'm a little curious about the dry storage and location. Is that something that is public knowledge, or is it something that is kept quiet so people don't know where it's located?
I would say it's public knowledge. It's located just a couple hundred yards from the normal facility and is very visible from the lake and other Google Maps and all these other things. So it's clearly public information.
But the area itself is quite secure, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. It is within the boundaries of our security barrier. We are required to defend and protect that fuel from any saboteur.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Representative Delperdang.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Couple questions specific on the rods. My understanding is they could be re-energized but we don't do that. What's the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, so back in the 1970s, going back to Jimmy Carter era, the notion at that time was still learning. I'd say the industry was still learning, so they wanted to control that fuel very well. So reprocessing was not allowed at that time. That was the standard that was set, and it hasn't been changed since. It is true that if you reprocessed it, you could get quite a bit of energy out of the fuel. So that's a possibility that could occur.
Is that any of that being looked at from a federal level? Do you know?
I would say it's being looked at. To say that it's being aggressively looked at would be saying too much, probably.
And then if I can continue, you didn't mention, but is there any plans within Kansas for SMRs?
So where we're at on SMR, small modular reactors, or new build across the board, let's just say, we're staying in tune with where the industry is going on this issue, working closely with NEI. We'll hear from them in a minute. I would say we're aware and keeping that in our mind about what's possible. But until we get to the point where we can see a proven technology that's there and that we know we can depend on the economics associated with it, it will still be something that we're just looking at. So it's an ongoing story is where I'll land on that.
And could you give an example of what kind of a footprint I would need for an SMR? I mean, I've been through Wolf Creek, so I know the size of that operation, but.
Yeah, we may hear a number on that, but we could put it on our property at Wolf Creek, for example.
Thank you.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. You just mentioned tornadoes. If a tornado did hit, you can close her down and everything would be safe?
Absolutely. If a tornado hits the place you want to.
1976 when the reactor went through there. And so I kind of saw where the start of this power plant. You know, to me, it seems like a real positive. Are we not building any in the United States, or they're not, you know, are we going to build any more, or are we going to just go with the other types of energies?
Yeah, there's two in construction in the United States right now. They're kind of struggling with the same problems they've been before. They're very expensive to build on the front side. And of course, you're then going to hopefully run them for many decades after, like we're doing with our plant. But getting over that initial capital outlay is a big part of the challenge. And simply because we're not building very many, our proficiency in doing so and getting all the economics right is challenged. Now, outside the United States, other countries are building them heavily. China, for example, I won't quote numbers and somebody else might, but they're actively building new plants. United Arab Emirates just put units on the line recently, for example. So,
Thank you.
India.
Yeah. Chair. Thank you.
Any other questions? Anybody online? Nobody online? I have, wait a minute. Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. They asked kind of the questions I was going to ask, because it is very prevalent in France. I think it's a large majority of their power, and you pointed that out. But for some reason, even though it's carbon-free, as you point out, it just doesn't happen here in the States. I think they've buried it as best they can with regulations. But my question is actually one around the 18-month run that you say you have. So is there a planned outage at that point, and how big an outage is that to get ready?
That's right. Yeah, generally 18 months we run, and then we will be offline for 40, 45 days, depending on the nature of work that we want to do during that period of time. And probably as the plant goes on, that time frame will be a little shorter. But what you do during that time frame is new fuel. So move all the fuel out, put new fuel in, major maintenance that you might have, and projects that require that configuration of the plant to implement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? Oh, did you have a question, Representative? Okay.
Thank you for one more. With the refueling, as we got to witness, I think, a couple of years ago, that process, the refueling itself is not, is still happening the same way as it did then. The transfer to this other storage facility is a separate operation, not a direct transfer from the unit to storage, to that outside storage. We're talking about the same process we saw before is still happening every 18 months or so for 45 days.
That's correct. So simplistically, the way it works is you bring about a half or a third of your fuel, you replace each outage, each refueling outage. So you bring it in, put it into the pool, take all the fuel out of the reactor, put some old fuel and some new fuel back into the reactor, and then some of the old fuel becomes resident in the pool. Okay? At the point where the pool is approaching being full or at its limits, be the better way to say it, we're then take some of that old fuel out and store it in this dry cask because it's so depleted that its heat generation is so low it can just sit there and generate a small amount of heat and be air cooled.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? Anyone online? Nobody? Cleve, when it began operations in September of '85, originally it had a 40-year license, so that would have ended in 2025, just about 3 years from now.
Right.
You got an extension of 20 years. I think I've read that there's a process NRC is looking at to extend, the plants could apply for another extension. Can you kind of put some details around that?
Yeah, it's a very comparable process to the one to get the first 20 years. The logic is you're reevaluating the plant based on its age and projecting forward that you're confident for that 20 years it will be safe. So it's a similar license review that occurred the first time. And other plants have done that successfully. Just worth noting, Wolf Creek is one of the younger plants in the fleet. Okay, so we're fortunate enough in that regard that we get to watch others go down many of these paths before it.
And I guess that'd be a follow-up that I'd have is, you know, it was one of the last built commercial reactors in the country. And then it just kind of fell off. And I know you mentioned that right now there's price competitiveness that's going on within the industry and kind of holding any further construction down. But at that time, back in the 80s, was that the same conditions back then of why utilities weren't looking to build additional reactors?
Well, I'll speculate a little bit because back in the 80s, I wasn't making those decisions. But I think then the notional piece about the cost was that it would be very cheap by comparison. I probably underestimated kind of some of the regulatory elements and the amount of effort it would take on a daily basis to run the plants, and probably less concern about the construction cost and construction delay cost that we would have today. And the reason small modular is part of that construction cost. You can fabricate big pieces and put them together.
Shorter time frame. Yeah. Okay, Cleve, thank you for coming up. We appreciate the information. You might hang around. There might be more questions after NEI presents. So
I will do that. Thank
appreciate
you very
your time.
much.
Next, we have Mark Nichols from the Nuclear Energy Institute. Welcome to the committee, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present here today. Just an introduction, the Nuclear Energy Institute is the Nuclear Energy Industries Trade Association. We represent the nuclear industry in mostly policy matters before Congress and our regulator and other things as well. My title is Senior Director of New Reactors at NEI, and within that, I manage our work and lead the industry on advanced reactors, small modular reactors, and the regulatory policy and business conditions. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about advanced reactors or small modular reactors. I do want to sort of bridge Cleve's presentation to this one. So as we talk about the future of advanced reactors, it's very important to recognize that future needs to be built on a solid foundation, and that solid foundation is our operating reactors. Not only are they the cheapest source of clean energy right now, continuing to make them operational, they're also the cheapest source of nuclear energy right now, keeping them operational. And by having our operating fleet like Wolf Creek continue to operate, we will have a foundation of skilled labor, safety culture, as well as the supply chain. So I do want to note that there is a connection between the operating reactors and advanced reactors. Next slide, please. So there are a number of different types of advanced reactor technologies. This slide gives you the range of those technologies in two major dimensions. One is in size, and the other is in the material that's used to cool the reactor. In terms of size, we have what are typically called small modular reactors there in the middle, and that is less than 300 megawatts of electric per reactor, and you can have more than one reactor at a site. Those would be called modules, and so the plant could actually be bigger than that. On the smaller side, we have microreactors, and microreactors are less than 20 megawatts electric generally. They're more suited for remote applications, Arctic villages, mining operations, that sort of thing. Or they could be used for very small microgrids for reliable and resilient power for those as well. There are some advanced reactors that are very large, up to 1,000 megawatts, but most of the advanced reactors are small or micro in size. In terms of the material used to cool the reactor, there are light water small modular reactors that's featured there, shown by NuScale. And that light water technology is what is used at Wolf Creek and all of the other operating reactors in the United States today. So they benefit from a lot of, thousands and thousands of operating hours of experience in terms of materials and chemistry and other physical features within the plant. The other reactors use different materials to cool the reactor. It could be high temperature gas, helium. It could be a liquid metal like lead or sodium, or it could be molten salt. It could be the coolant as well. And even many of those molten salt reactors, the fuel itself is actually dissolved in the molten salt. And so it's not a solid fuel like we're used to today, but it's sort of ingrained in that. The other feature of the other non-water-cooled reactors is that they can operate at higher temperatures, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Yep, thank you. Next slide. I do want to talk about the versatility that's being built into advanced reactors. So today's operating reactors are generally a single product for the market. Now, Cleve talked about different makes and models. We have the Westinghouse, or we have a GE design, and there are differences, but generally they're about 1,000 megawatts of power, and that serves its role very, very well. It's a large base load source of power on the grid. It can feed and serve large loads. But what we have recognized and what we've seen from the market is a need and desire for other nuclear products. And so small modular reactors, which would also fit in on the grid, they would come in smaller increments. There's advantages to that. One is that you don't always need 1,000 megawatts. Sometimes you only need 300 megawatts. And the other advantage is that the smaller size comes with smaller capital cost. And so affording 1,000 megawatt plant is very difficult for most utilities. You have to be very large and well capitalized. The smaller capital cost of a 300 megawatt reactor now opens up nuclear to utilities that could never before afford it. And we're actually seeing that in many of the projects that are moving forward, I'll talk about later. But we're seeing those are companies, utilities that have never before owned nuclear are now starting to reach out and start projects on that. I talked about the mini being well suited for remote applications. The other thing that we're building into this is versatility in what type of energy products they can produce. So our operating reactors produce electricity. We are actually looking at how the operating reactors could produce hydrogen as well, since that's becoming of more interest. But when you design it from the very beginning that an advanced reactor can produce not just electricity, but heat for industrial processes, or hydrogen, you can make a more efficient and flexible integrated energy system. That's really also important for integrating with renewables. So we know two things. One is the nature of renewables and the nature of load changes over the day create some unpredictability about when you would actually need a flexible source of electricity. Right now, that flexible source is natural gas. And so it would have to come on and off rapidly and on demand. So we're developing advanced reactors to be able to do that, to meet that flexible dispatch into the electric grid. But the other thing we know is that nuclear power plants are characterized by large capital cost and very small operating and maintenance costs. And so the economics work best when you're using a nuclear reactor to produce power at 100% all the time. And so that's where the flexibility comes in. You can produce electricity. You can not produce electricity and produce hydrogen or another energy product, or even put it into heat storage. And so that's the variety of outputs we're developing. And all of that now opens up the world of uses for nuclear energy. Beyond just powering electricity through the homes and businesses and factories, we can now use this to generate the hydrogen and other energy products to help decarbonize not just the electric sector, but other energy sectors. So I would just note that the carbon emissions from electricity is only about a third of all carbon emissions. And so if to decarbonize the other 2/3, we have to look at clean energy sources for hydrogen and process heat. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. One of the other things we know about advanced reactors is that we need to design them for cost and a cost that's competitive in the market. What we have found is the old notion of economies of size, build nuclear power plants bigger to optimize and reduce cost, was true. However, as we look at smaller reactors, we found that there's a different economies that we can look for. I call it economies of simplicity or even economies of safety. As you make these smaller, you do two things. You actually help to make them enhance safety, but you also help to enhance the costs as well. And the reason is that as you make them smaller, one, you have a smaller amount of radioactive material in the reactor, and so there's lower potential hazard to the public. But what you also do as you make them smaller, you start to rely more on natural physics, gravity, natural circulation. Those things, because nature always works, you don't have to have as many pumps and valves and piping that you would for larger plants. And so as you are able to rely more on natural physics and eliminate the need for those pumps, valves, and piping, you help to make it simpler. It's safer. There's fewer things that can go wrong. But you've also removed a lot of stuff from the reactor that costs money. And so it's counterintuitive, but safety and cost reduction go hand in hand in these advanced reactors, and it's quite remarkable. So that's simpler. As you also make these smaller, you get another set of advantages. The 300 megawatts size of these, they fit, and they can actually be designed for this. They fit better with existing equipment you can buy from other industries, pumps, valves, those sorts of things. You don't have to have specially designed nuclear things that cost more because there's no other market to drive volume in that type of equipment. And as you make them smaller, you can actually manufacture them more in a factory. What that means is you can put more of the construction processes in parallel. You can reduce actually the construction time that way. You can move more of the construction out of the field and into the factory. And what that helps to do is you have better control over the quality and production in a factory setting than you do out in a construction field. And so you help to reduce a lot of the labor and materials that go into construction, and that helps to reduce cost as well. And then there's the improved performance. I talked about the higher temperatures. As some of those reactors go to higher temperatures, we're looking at getting to higher efficiency, converting energy, heat into electricity. as well. Next slide, please. So cost is important, not just from a competitive standpoint in terms of nuclear. The utility is always going to choose the lowest cost option. So we have to reduce our costs to be competitive in that nature. But as we look at how do you fit advanced reactors into an electricity grid system, we know that there is a lot of interest in reducing carbon emissions in the electricity sector, whether it comes from state policies, federal policies, or even utility commitments. There is a drive toward lower carbon in the electricity sector. That has given development to a lot of renewables as well to help achieve that. But we also know that clean is not the only variable we have to optimize. It has to be reliable. It's no good if you can't, when you turn on the lights, the switch, the lights don't come on. If the power's not there when you need it, that has huge disruptions to society. So it has to be clean, it has to be reliable, but it has to be affordable too. You can't have clean and reliable at any cost. There is a cost at which you have to maintain affordability. And so it's not the optimization of just one of those parameters, it's the optimization of all three of those parameters. And that's the point of this graph here. This was a study by E3, it was for Washington State, primarily for Energy Northwest out there, as Washington State went from a renewable portfolio standard to 100% clean energy, I think it's by 2030, I forget the date. The utility started to ask themselves, well, how do we get there? And there's a growing notion out there that, well, you might be able to get to 80% carbon reduction just by renewables and storage, battery storage alone. Others may put that number down at 30 or 40%. But the consensus is that you need another technology if you're going to get to 100%. And so this study out there looked at, well, how do we optimize reliability, clean, and affordability? And what they found is, at least out in their system, as you get above 90% carbon reduction, the portfolio decisions you make have a huge impact on cost. And so if you try to do it renewables and storage alone, you have a lot of cost. This is, I think, $8 billion. I think that's annually, actually. And if you add in CGS, that's the operating Columbia Generating Station, that brings the cost down. But what they found is you actually have to add in SMRs, into more SMRs into the grid to be able to optimize the cost. And so you can see a huge cost differential, especially at the higher decarbonization, if you include SMRs or you don't include SMRs. That's what they found. Other utilities are doing their own studies and coming to similar conclusions. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? The slide after this, I'm going to talk about projects that are ongoing. Many of them have government support. It is true there are no advanced reactors, SMRs, operational in the United States. There's some internationally. And so where we are in the United States with our technology is that it's rapidly maturing. So there's one design that has been approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, others that are going through the process or about to begin the process of approval. But what we know from deploying first-of-a-kind technologies is that first-of-a-kind is almost always more expensive than the lowest cost alternative in the market. And so the question is, how do you get a first-of-a-kind technology into the market if it's more expensive and the customer has to choose the lowest cost option? That's where government comes in. To bridge that first-of-a-kind cost, we've seen the government do it for renewables. They help bridge the first-of-a-kind cost for renewables until it could come down the cost curve and compete on its own without further support. And that's what we've have predicted will also happen with SMRs. So the first thing that the policies need to do is treat nuclear fairly according with other zero carbon technologies and not exclude us unnecessarily. The next thing is actual federal programs, and many of these are in place, and the government's talking about additional support as well. There is cost share funding for demonstrations. There are tax credits, they're specifically production tax credits already on the books. For new nuclear, other tax credits are being discussed. There are federal loan guarantees, and there is even discussion of the use of federal power purchase agreements to help make these things happen. There is also there are also policy tools that states have to be able to help in this regard. Some states, I'll actually show a list later, have started to go through initiating policy, but there are things ranging from tax incentives all the way down to investing in infrastructure like helping community college build training programs for the workers that are going to go to these plants. Next slide, please. This is the status of demonstrations in the United States. It's it's about 68 actually different designs that are moving forward with committed demonstrations. All of these are expected to be operational by 2030. NuScale, TerraPower, X-Energy, they're all supported 50-50 cost shares by the federal government. They all have utility partners. Many of them, all three of those, because it's UAMPS, Pacific Corp, and instead of Energy Northwest, that's Grant County Public Utility District, have never before owned a nuclear power plant. And so they're some of the first ones out there. There is also a handful of microreactors that are looking to be built as well. Next slide, please. I want to end on what is the utility and state interest. The state interest we've seen increase dramatically over the past few years, and especially this year. There have been a number of bills introduced, and many of them have passed. These bills range from, let's just say, Montana, which had a moratorium on new nuclear. They repealed that moratorium on new nuclear in the state last year. And at the same time, they passed another bill to study what could you do with SMRs in the state of Montana. Specifically, they're looking at what the future of Colstrip, a major coal plant out there that's scheduled to be shut down. What do you do with Colstrip, which has a great infrastructure node on the grid, and it's also facing the prospects of losing jobs and economic benefits from the plants, and they're looking at an SMR on whether that would make sense or not for those states. There are states like Nebraska just over the border last year that passed a bill that enabled state tax incentives for clean energy projects to be extended to nuclear as well. There's a lot of things there. And then on the utility side, we see everything from utilities just starting to understand whether this technology is right, might be right for them someday in the future, to including it into their integrated resource plans, to actually beginning to launch projects and deploy new nuclear in the near future. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Questions, committee? Representative Delperdang.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. First question, are you from here?
I'm not. No, I'm based out of Virginia.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Southwest Power Pool? That's where we're all kind of plugged into through the Midwest.
Vaguely.
Yeah. Nebraska's on here, obviously, as part of the Southwest Power Pool, but I didn't see anything else. I was just curious, within the Southwest Power Pool, have we got any plants in the works that they had looked at, or is Nebraska the first one that they actually passed some bills for it?
Yeah, not knowing the territory exactly, but just between Nebraska and Kansas, Nebraska is now moving out front, or at least the state is moving out front and trying to encourage nuclear within the state. When we visited them, they had an advanced nuclear forum up there last fall. And what we heard at that forum is that they're very concerned about reliability, and the fact that they had to ship power down to Texas, and their customers had lost power during a storm, concerned them. And so they're looking at SMRs to help build reliability.
Could you maybe give us the 30-second run of what should Kansas do moving forward to get us up there with them?
Yeah, I can't advise in your specific situation. I don't know your state well enough to know. But I would say that we have information and resources that lay out a bunch of options that you could do. You could do anything from study SMRs and see if it makes sense for you and your state, all the way up to you could consider tax incentives for new nuclear projects.
Thank you.
Representative Berquist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The pages you have on, on the current status of demonstrations, would you say that all these projects involve something that could be modularized and added unit-wise? I mean, if you had a 300, then you could add a 3 and a 3. So does that make, and my question is, does that make the system sustainable in a continuum where if there's 4 units, that 1 could be shut down while 3 continue to operate fully, so that that you don't have a 45-day or a, you know, every 18 months a complete shutdown, or whatever that time frame is?
Yeah, absolutely. All of these are modular, and so there are, just looking at the small modular reactors here, there's a X-Energy, which has 4 modules or reactors, each at 80 megawatts. There's GE, which is on the other extreme. They have 1 module for 300 megawatts, so each one would be an extra 300 megawatts. I'll take NuScale as an example, because they have some of the more flexibility in terms of modularity. Their standard design is 12 reactors, and you have options that you could build it out at 8, 6, or 4 reactors. Now, the NuScale design is interesting in that they all are located in a common pool. This would be for emergency cooling if you needed it. And so it's sort of akin to building a garage, and that is the size of the facility. So you build a garage for 12, 8, or 6 reactors, and then each reactor is your car. So you build the garage up front because you know you're going to need it in the future, but you only buy each car as you need another car. But when you get to, say, 12 reactors, because the NuScale has refueling every about year and a half or 2 years, that means one is always in refueling, and so you're effectively operating with 11 reactors full power all the time, and you never have to shut down and lose all of that power at once. So, yeah.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Other questions from the committee? Online? I don't see anyone. Mark, I have a couple questions. One is with the SMRs, can you talk a little bit about some of the other aspects of these when compared to the larger reactors that Cleve was talking about, such as emergency planning, the size of the fuel rods and so forth? Is there going to have to be a lot of re-engineering at the processing plants for different size of rods, pellets, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, let me take I'll say the safety aspects first, because I talked a little bit about enhanced safety. I do want to make sure everybody is aware that our operating plants like Wolf Creek are extremely safe plants. And the NRC has independently verified that. If you look at the safety record of all industries, not just electric technologies, nuclear is one of the safest industries out there in terms of radiological injuries are almost not, well, they are non-existent, and then OSHA occupational industries are very, very low. So I did want to make sure that when we talk about enhanced safety for advanced reactors, we're talking about going beyond what is already exceptional safety. And so when you get to that, the smaller amount of radiological material that I talked about, the fact that you can now rely on natural physics, gravity, natural circulation, what we find is that safety is enhanced in a couple of different ways. One is there's a smaller potential hazard there to begin with. Accidents are less likely to occur, or they've been eliminated altogether. And then third, if an accident were to occur, you have even more time to respond. I'll just take NuScale again as an example. And if you think about Fukushima accident, the reason it was a really bad accident is because they lost their diesel generators, the emergency backup power that they needed to power the pumps to continue to pump water through the core and remove heat. Well, these have been designed, many of these have been designed so that if you lose all power, no worries. If you can't get more water in there, no worries. They've been designed with that natural physics so that it can continue to cool itself indefinitely without that operator action, power, or water that's required by, say, the Fukushima design. And so that enhances the safety. All of that means, because there's such a smaller risk to the public, that the NRC is now willing to accept, well, could we have a smaller emergency planning zone? They're going through rulemaking right now. Actually, the final rule went to the commission for approval to allow a site boundary EPZ for a design that can demonstrate that. And so what we have today is 10-mile EPZs, and you have planning and all that sort of stuff would be greatly reduced. Similar advantages on physical security and what it would take to protect these against a malevolent threat. So yeah, absolutely, there are, and some of those translate into economic benefits and operational simplification. And in relation to fuel, some of the light water SMRs will use fuel almost identical to today's reactors. They're actually half height, so they're not as tall, but otherwise dimensions are exactly the same. So they use the existing fuel supply infrastructure, not a problem. The non-water cooled reactors, they will use different fuel types. They'll use different materials for the fuel. They'll use different forms for the fuel. The actual production of the fuel, we call it fuel fabrication, is not a challenge. We can retool the factories to produce that fuel and materials, not an issue. The one challenge they have is that many of them also use slightly higher enrichments. So if today we use 5% enriched fuel, they use almost close to 20% enriched fuel. It's still low enrichment, and so it's still safe. The problem is we don't have any capacity or production capabilities for that fuel in the United States. We can get it from Russia. So there is some supply chain uncertainty right there that we're trying to work through.
Representative Delperdang?
Thank you for letting me jump in again. Today on your typical plant or the fuel you're using in them now, what temperature do the rods produce? And then as it gets spent before, does it drop in temperature over a certain period of time before you replace it out? And if so, what are we talking there?
Yeah, I'd have to ask Cleve for today's temperatures. I don't recall. I think it's around 300 C, but.
Yeah, it's roughly 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit inside the interior of the rod, and then the outside of the rod, roughly around 600 degrees where the water touches it.
So when you get into your SMRs, is it a lower operating temperature?
No, so the light water SMRs would be very similar in terms of the heat and temperatures. The non-water cooled would actually be higher temperatures because the materials are designed to operate at higher temperatures.
Okay. And then if I can ask a question I asked the previous speaker, there was why, and I understand the legalities of it, but why can we not re-enrich what's out there rather than storing it? What's the pitfalls of it?
Yeah, so the recycle, it is true that Carter had a prohibition on recycling. Reagan came in and repealed that prohibition. I think there was some similar action from Clinton that was repealed by the second Bush. So there's no legal limitation or restriction against recycling in the United States. It's purely economics. In that today, your price of uranium is so low that it is far cheaper to mine new uranium, enrich it, and then use it than it is to recycle. And so we do believe that the amount of energy used from the nuclear fuel is only about 4%. So 96% is still reusable energy. I do believe that someday in the future, as uranium prices go up and the economics make sense, that we'll begin to recycle future. But when that occurs, nobody knows.
Okay, so we are open to re-enrich. Then do we consider the cost of long-term storage? Versus if you reused it, obviously you're using it, you're not just storing it somewhere.
Yeah, that is the cost, or I'd say the opportunity cost of long-term storage and disposal is considered in that economic evaluation. And it is important, I would say, that the cost of managing used fuel and disposing of used fuel, as well as the cost of decommissioning reactors, are calculated into the price of electricity, and those costs are collected over the lifetime of the plant. So they're paid for well in advance.
Appreciate you making the trip out here. So thank you.
Other questions from the committee? I just want to kind of go back to Leo's question on the waste situation. Can you kind of update us where that stands now as far as, whether there's some regional interim storage sites or national storage sites that are being contemplated and kind of where they stand? And
Yeah, I'd be happy. I like to talk about used fuel. I used to do used fuel it previously. And used fuel is one of the things that people will point to and say, you shouldn't build new reactors, or, nuclear is not good because you don't know what to do with the used fuel. And I don't believe that that's the case. I actually think we have a good story to tell about used fuel. So if you think about all of the things you have to have in place to deal with the waste of any technology, you need to first know how to handle it safely, and we can do that in the nuclear industry. You've seen the dry cask storage systems. They've been independently verified by the NRC to be safe. We can store them safely in that interim storage configuration for hundreds of years safely. We know how to do that, and we have the technology to do that. Even the technology for final disposal we have available, and the NRC has reviewed the safety case for Yucca Mountain and shown that, yes, you could dispose of used fuel safely in Yucca Mountain. So we have the technologies to do it safely. You have to have it paid for. I just talked about how we collect that money up front, and so it's paid for. I think the amount of money sitting in a trust fund to pay for disposal is over $40 billion right now, and it's continuing to grow based on interest. And it's more than enough to pay for the disposal of the used fuel. The third thing you have to have is a place for it. And we do have a place designated by law, that's Yucca Mountain. I know that there is a political discussion in Congress about whether we should really dispose of it there or we should pick a different location. And as that process works out, one thing is, as that process works out, we know that eventually that problem will be resolved and we'll find a place to put it. In the meantime, as I just said, we can store it safely where it is for a very long time. That's not what we want to do, but we can do it safely. And industry is being proactive and actually looking at, well, can we develop what we call a consolidated interim storage facility? There are projects underway in New Mexico and Texas looking at, well, could we use these sites for interim storage? And there's even licensing work going on with that. Now, when those might materialize is not certain. The Department of Energy is also starting a look at interim storage from a federal level. And so there is a lot of movement to address the issue. And so I would say that if you look at the bigger picture, we actually have a good story to tell.
I know there's been several reactors that have been shut down the last decade or so. Are they still storing? And most of them have gone to a dry cask storage system before they shut down, but those casks are still on that site, or are they being consolidated anywhere?
Yeah, so the permanently shut down nuclear reactors, and they've been decommissioned to take away the reactor building and all the radioactive material, they will still have the dry cask at that location. We call it an ISFSI, Independent Spent Fuel Storage Installation. It's actually not that large. The other thing to note about nuclear used fuel is that it's a very small quantity and it's in a solid form. If you take all the used fuel produced by the nuclear reactors in the United States, that's about 20% of our power for over 40 years, it would fit on the size of a football field. It's not that much used fuel. And so the amount of used fuel, the dry storage casks, and sitting at these retired facilities that have otherwise been greenfielded is very small. It's well protected. There still is security there to protect it. But the other feature is that the design of these casks are very robust as well. There has been tests of military missiles trying to shoot and hit these dry storage casks, and the casks survive without any without any harm. So they're very well protected, and
Just for the committee's information, I've been working on a bill on transportation fees associated with the transport of radioactive materials. I'm a member of the Council of State Governments Midwest Radioactive Material Transportation Committee, and at our last meeting in December, I noticed that Kansas doesn't have a fee structure. Most of the states around us do, as fuel could be transported in the future. So I asked the reviser to mirror what Missouri's doing, because it seemed logical. A lot of that stuff might be coming along I-70, but so I hope to get that introduced in the House Transportation Committee. But those fees are set up so that then, as communities, as routes get developed, you know, if spent fuel and a site gets designated down the road, that the transportation of that, as they go through different states, will have different fees, and those fees will be used by communities, by the state, to pay for escort vehicles if those are needed, or emergency training for state and local officials, that sort of thing. And I'd like to have that in place before anything kind of gets decided down the road, so at least we have a framework to work from and not have to jump through hoops to get it done rather quickly. So I hope to get that introduced yet this year. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Sir, you said the waste material will be about the size of a football field. How deep would it be?
I think that's about 10 feet deep. We can get the exact number, but it's like 10 feet deep.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions? Any questions for Cleve, for folks from Wolf Creek? I do have a follow-up with Cleve, if I could, Mark. I've asked this of some of the folks that have appeared to us this year, but there's a lot of talk on supply chain issues, staffing issues, and so forth in a number of different industries. Can you talk a little bit about that associated with Wolf Creek operations and so forth, what you're having to deal with there?
And particularly around COVID consequence kind of stuff?
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Okay. So from a supply chain perspective, we have not seen any substantial interruptions. I would say there have been some minor project issues on collateral to the plant that have had some issues, but nothing substantial, no disruptions in our business, and no high-risk things that we've had to navigate in that regard. In terms of staffing, the impacts of the pandemic have been on us have been similar to the rest of society in terms of number of cases and so forth. We're now, since the inception, over 300 cases out of 800 people, to give you a rough perspective. But our people have done a really nice job of social distancing and all the things that we're doing to maintain continuity. Because we have positions that are 24/7 on site, have to be on site to perform them. And we have not seen any substantial challenges to those as we've gone forward. Most recently, we've actually, in the last month, has been our highest month so far. And we have seen impacts and some needed overtime coverage by other people to cover for the people that have gotten the coronavirus. So,
Thank you. Representative Delperdang, again.
Thank you for the third time. You may or may not have the answer on this, but what is the typical output of a wind turbine, one of the towers? Is it a megawatt? Is it 2 megawatt or?
I am not an expert, okay,
No.
but I have asked the same kind of questions. The ones I'm familiar with are 2.25. You're telling me on that? 2.25.
Be the big ones then.
Yes, and of course that assumes some wind speed, and I've gotten to the edge of my expertise. I probably want to.
I'm just thinking the Wolf Creek, that's going to replace 600 to maybe 1,000 towers. Plus,
Yeah.
it tends not to freeze up, right?
Yeah, you can start making that math, and of course back to some of the other points. And I don't want to speak necessarily for or against. Right, I spoke earlier that diversity key element there, but obviously nuclear has a reliability element there, and its
And
production
it's not a
is
cut
not
on wind. I'm
dependent
just
on
thinking, if
speed
we
of wind.
get more of the SMRs or start getting them in here,
Right.
I guess I'm just looking at it as a safe, fairly reliable type of an energy source.
Right.
So, okay,
Absolutely.
appreciate you taking a stab at it.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Okay, I've got one more. Chairman's prerogative. But as many of you know, I've worked at Wolf Creek for a number of years. But Cleve, you know, I think the owners of Wolf Creek were kind of ahead of their time back when they developed the SNUP system, the Standardized Nuclear Unit Power Plant System, to rather than trying to design, build each reactor separately, they kind of formed a consortium to do that, but only two were built, Wolf Creek and Callaway. Can you talk a little bit about that, the value that's kind of created by having, you know, especially as close as both of them are to each other, the value of having very similar plants close by?
Yeah, I will, and one built in the UK as well, right? So, so what this means is it's an interesting facet of the industry back during the days, and I guess it reflects our society and our country. It was a competitive thing, and I mentioned the Ford, Chevy, Dodge thing before. It's kind of the same thing, right? You had the big manufacturers that were competing for the opportunity to build these plants. So and then just time evolution of the plants. So there is quite a bit of variety among the plants, okay, generally speaking in this country. It happens to be that it got down to later in the life where you started seeing standardized designs, and we're one of those with Callaway, located in Missouri. So it's a benefit to us in terms of, like I spoke earlier, sharing information, learning. When we learn something that's important, it's a phone call. We all know our counterparts at the other plant. So that information is shared very quickly. If we have a question where we face a new challenge, call over, have you seen this? So the information exchange is very rapid, beneficial to both, and collaborative in both cases. In some cases, materials. You spoke of that earlier. So if we have a piece of equipment that breaks and for whatever reason we don't have a spare part, we can call over. They will likely have it. So between the two of us, we like to think we have all the right spare parts, but things happen, right? So, but between the two of us, there's a high probability that we have the parts, so it maintains continuity. And we have all the agreements associated with, you know, buying and selling parts to each other set there, and those are very smooth to maintain continuity of both plants and safety of both plants. So.
Great. Okay, one last call. I don't have any other questions, by the way, but anyway. I want to thank Mark and Cleve for coming in today and educating us on the small modular nuclear reactors and on Wolf Creek. I think it's been a good discussion, and we've usually end at 10:30, but we're ending a little bit early. So if you're around, maybe individuals may want to visit with you off to the side. So
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I'll make myself available.
okay, thank you. Committee, right now we're still on for Thursday, depending on weather, of course. But the SPP will be in. Actually, they won't be in. They'll be in virtually because of the weather. Excuse me. They weren't able to fly in on Wednesday, and so they'll be virtually, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions on the operations of that regional system and how it operates and coordinates with all the different utilities in the SPP footprint. So again, thanks to our presenters, and the meeting is adjourned.